This Saturday morning, we're talking to the University of New Mexico professor Melina Vizcaino-Aleman, who is in the English department. She is going to be discussing her dissertation completed in 2010 in American Studies. She worked with well-known New Mexican, Nuevo Mexicano, Chicano scholar Gabriel Melendez. Her dissertation is titled Triptych Cultural Critique, Fray Angelico Chavez and Southwestern Critical Regionalism, 1939 through 2004. She teaches courses in Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx literature. So I'm going to read just a few sections of Melina Vizcaino's abstract to prepare you for the conversation that's going to come. Fray Angelico Chavez was a Franciscan priest and man of letters who published writings that span most of the 20th century. He was born in Wagon Mound in New Mexico on April 10th, 1910, and he entered the St. Francis Franciscan Seminary in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1924. In 1937, he returned to Santa Fe and was ordained a Franciscan priest in St. Francis Cathedral. By this time, he was a well-known Catholic poet. This dissertation is a critical biography of Fray Angelico's writing, and it uses religion as a critical lens for understanding his work in relation to a host of other Southwestern regional writers, both Anglo and Mexican American. The main objective of this dissertation is to build and apply a comparative methodology that I call Triptych Cultural Critique to understand better the different modes of regional writing about the Southwest. Fray Angelico's work dialogues with Anglo-Southwestern and Chicano literary canons in ways that redefine them, and so he is central to this dissertation and its focus on comparative regionalisms. And you, all the viewers, should know that Melina is speaking to a group of about 5 graduate students and myself, Michael Trujillo, about writing a dissertation, and we're using her dissertation as an example. I picked this dissertation for these purposes because, 1, it focuses on Mexico. 2, I wanted an example of literary criticism. And 3, and I've told Melina this, it is a beautiful dissertation. When we approach Melina's discussion, I want to do it through our earlier discussions about how I'm asking you to read these different dissertations, which is a reverse engineering back to the prospectus, because all of you are in the process of writing a prospectus. I always ask you to think about what is your theory, what is your method, what are your questions, and what is your evidence, and that all of these have to work together. And if you have all of these things, you probably have a sound research project plan. And the way I think of the prospectus, what I want in a prospectus is a sound research plan. And finally, something slightly different is its significance. Where is your dissertation making an intervention into the conversation in your discipline and your field? And I hope all of you have questions and comments. But now I'll hand this Vizcaino-Aleman.
Thank you, Dr. Trujillo. Thank you, all of you, for having me. I'm honored and also humbled that you're reading my dissertation, which has been a while now. Again, I'm glad that it's still of some kind of relevance to everyone, at least the people in the room. I guess coming off of those comments, I would say, I think probably the most important thing for me was to figuring out what my fields were, especially in an American studies or in any program or department that's interdisciplinary, where you have multiple modes of looking at things, multiple people informing what you're doing, your method. It's not just a close literary analysis of set of texts, but for American studies and ethnic studies, Chicano, Chicana studies as well, we are interested in the sociological.
I was going to point out so that you come from an interdisciplinary field.
And I have my dissertation too. I actually started reading it again. It's huge. It's a big old tome. I'm like, what the? I wrote this. And you kind of write it, you leave it, and then it's done because it's done. It got you through. But I actually went back to start reading it, and I'm like, this is actually a pretty good dissertation. wow, I wrote that. I would say that this is probably my best writing. So, and I published a book and, I've done my articles and, all the stuff you have to do to stay relevant, get tenure, and also just be, the scholar that you want to be. This is probably my best writing because it's probably the most razor focused. So I would say to all of you, really enjoy this time, because once you get into the profession or whatever line of work you end up in, you're really forced to sit down and focus and figure out, like, what are my fields of study? What conversations am I having? And I think for me, at the time when I was in American Studies, the comps really prepared me for that. And I think that the structure that they had, and I believe Chicano studies follows similar structure, really helped me figure out, like, get a good footing, for I don't really think that any of the material literally made it into my dissertation from my comps, but it certainly helped me figure out, like, where's my scholarship? Where is it relevant? Who's it speaking to? And the question, like, what intervention am I making? Well, you kind of have to know who you're speaking to know what's your intervention. So I would say from the start, the comps were really, really important. I already knew what I wanted to write on by the time I got to my doctoral program. So my thesis, my MA thesis, was also critically important and, like, laying the foundation. So I had all of these ways of scaffolding to get to the final product. And my advisor, Gabriel Melendez, he was great. We actually locked heads multiple times. And it forced me to really write crisply and to say what it is I'm saying and to make sense, even to those who might not necessarily agree, because the point isn't agreement. The point is dialogue and discussion and how you can take it on to the next level or the next stage of the conversation. And so for me, the main sort of field, I would say, was Southwest studies and Chicano and Chicana cultural studies. Those were really the ones that you can see that I'm trying to navigate and balance. And for me, Fray Angelico was the middle point, and that was kind of the idea of a triptych. I love the idea of a lens and a theory, like difference between a lens and a theory. I actually think everything is both. And so I would say the triptych is really sort of both. For me, it became more of a lens for exploring and tying these different writers together, using Fray Angelico as the middle ground, the interconnecting piece. But the triptychs also, it's part of this larger kind of religious art history that Fray Angelico wrote on in his thesis. So he was theorizing around this idea of the triptych, and I kind of took that from him and then developed it, expanded it in a way that made sense to cultural studies. How do you take a religious concept and develop it so that it's relevant beyond just that community? So that was what I was doing with Triptych. And clearly I'm engaged in all of these theories, but I think ultimately what was really important for me was Fray Angelico's work. Like, what is the work telling me? What is the theory that's coming out of the literature? Rather than saying, oh, I'm going to be a post-structuralist and I'm going to take post-structuralism and apply it to this text, I was more interested in, well, how is this text post-structuralist? Or, well, in what ways does it express that? Or how is it different? Or, so it was more like reading the text and then figuring out what's the theory that's coming out of the text.
I mean, I always think that every dissertation can start with one of these places. Some people start here, some people start here. And when you started here, because I think you've always been kind of a literary person, right? So you always
Absolutely.
read things, and your evidence was going to be texts primarily, although you're doing that oral history now too.
Absolutely.
And you were fascinated probably by, you were like me, and more than me, because you know Angelico Chavez all the way through, all his writings, your universe is everything that he wrote,
Yes.
published, and in archival materials. You know
Yeah.
him well, but
Yeah.
you started there. You were fascinated by Angelico Chavez, who is
Absolutely.
fascinating, right?
Yeah.
Fascinating.
And like you said, very interesting. His work is like, oh, this is written really well, but at the same time, it's like, wow, he was kind of not a good person. I mean, you know what I mean? It's like, I don't really know if I agree with, I took an autobiography class with Dr. Melendez when I was a master's student. I just got really fast. I'm a reader. I've always been a reader. I guess that's why I end up in English anyway. I just read. And so that's where I encountered, I discovered that really that's where I first learned of Fray Angelico's The Autobiography of an Ancient Statue. And I was just like, what is this strange little text? Like, who wrote this? And like, so it was there that everything just was like, I just read everything that, I ended up reading his editorials and like, the New Mexico magazine, which he was doing, in retirement. I have so much medical material. It's like a little bit insane. But you're right. This person is very interesting.
You're going somewhere, so I don't want to interrupt it too much, but something that I'm asking the students to think through with regards to your dissertation, which is not as evident for some of those folks in kind of social sciencey, right? They have questions, and then there's a clear section on methodology. You could talk about the triptych as a methodology. In addition to that, in those texts, say in the education department, they'll say, these are my questions. And I'm asking students to work through what were your questions. So as you move forward, maybe that's something that you can speak to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it had a lot to do with the two fields, I guess you could say, that I was interested in. I mean, always interested in the Southwest, like the early 20th century writers era and, Mary Austin, Alice Corbin Henderson, those folks, right? I think in many ways, Chicano studies was like, or Chicano movement was like, well, that's not us. We're going to do something else. Like, this has been, we've been appropriated, we've been mythologized, we've been spoken for, we've and good romanticized or, vilified or whatever the case is. And for me, I just was really trying to figure out, well, how are these two fields having a conversation, or how can I have them have a conversation? Like, how do I put them into conversation, recognizing, the critiques that the Chicano movement was making and saying, like, we have our own, literary, cultural traditions and histories, and we could speak for ourselves. And I was always interested as a grad student in the earlier period, the Mexican American period, I guess you could say. And what's, I guess, like, I know there's a break, but how is there like this, I guess, consistency over time, and so that's also why I was interested in Fray Angelico, because I felt like there was something there with his work, because had this longevity. Like, well, what does his work tell us about these eras, these generations, and the conversation that perhaps Chicano studies could have with Southwest studies, or that they were already having, and not just in a conflicted way. So those were my questions, I think, going in. And then also being a Mexicana, and more specifically being a Burqueña. I mean, I've lived here all my life. So I really was asking questions about my place without really them being on the page. It's very academic. Like, the I never really enters the page at all. And because that's sort of the academic training that I think I received and took in, and also felt comfortable with. I feel comfortable thinking about my place in the world, but at a distance through Fray Angelico. That's what makes me part of Chicano studies, if not Chicana. That's my field, but that's also my personhood. It's always, the person is always in what you do, even if it doesn't come out on the page. The dialogue, the discourse at the time was critical regionalism. So I latched onto that concept. It sounds cool, right? I'll be talking to people at the dinner table and say, oh, I'm writing a dissertation on critical regionalism. Oh, what's that? I was like, I don't really know. I'm trying to figure it out. So that was the term.
It doesn't sort of work for us, right? Because regionalism and to be a regionalist is not cool. Right? And so
Exactly.
many of us were trying to intervene by saying we do critical regionalism, and it has these different formations, which we can all talk about or at some other point. But yours is one. And I think you're doing something different than Shelton or Eleanor Frampton. You're doing your own thing, which I think emerged on its own.
I mean, so there was the triptych over here and critical regionalism over here, right? So triptych came out of like my own research. I guess you could say archival. It became archival during my coursework. It was all in the library, just like in the stacks, finding Fray Angelico's La Conquistadora. And then once you go into the stacks and there's all this other stuff and you're like, oh my gosh, look at all this stuff. And so I just started collecting all this published work. After I got over the comps and then the prospectus, I did do the archival research. I went to Cincinnati. I went to the St. John Baptist Franciscan Archives. I never made it to Arkansas. The University of Arkansas, Fayetteville also have in the John Gould Fletcher collection, they have a cache of letters, but they actually ended up sending them to me. I didn't have to go, but the archival stuff happened afterwards, collecting all this unpublished material, letters, all of that. So that's how the triptych aspect of it all came out from the archival library research that I had done. And then the critical regionalism, that was the thing, that was the lingo. So it was, again, me sort of trying to bring these two things together, try to make sense of the theory, I suppose, through the lens that I was seeing in Fray Angelico's work and then bringing them together. So there was synergies there, it wasn't like I was just making it up. Because I think often we feel like, at least I do, I'm like, am I just making this up? Does this have any validity? But it did, once it started coming together. And then, like I said, I go back and I'm reading my dissertation. It's been 16 years, right? And I'm like, this is pretty good. So it stood the test of my time.
A lot of dissertations you look at them and they do look like artifacts of a particular time. They don't stand the test of time. This one does. This one does.
Thank you. I probably wouldn't have gone back to read it because it's like, no, I don't want to read that. I'm done with it. So I'm like, well, other people are reading it. I better read it. What's the hype? So yeah, I don't know. Do folks have questions? Does anyone have a question or comment? Yeah, Colton.
Sorry, I'm squinting. I have a headache. I'm not trying to mean mug anyone. So you're talking about how the triptych idea is coming directly from Fray Angelico's work. At what point did you realize that it could actually speak to that critical regionalism, I guess? Like, not just describing his understanding in his work, but where you realize the application to that larger location, I guess.
Yeah. So the other thing, and this was already on my mind going and reading the triptych, was third space theory, on Zaldúa. And Zaldúa has also been incorporated in critical regionalism. So as the thematic west. Neil Campbell. I'm sorry. Who did you say?
Alex Trimble Young, he has an article called The
Oh,
Rhizomatic West.
I'll know Alec. Okay, he's got an article. He's probably drawing on Neil Campbell's Rhizomatic West, is my guess, which is, of course, drawing on Deleuze and Guattari's, work, Thousand Plateaus. So there's already these theories, right, talking about like the third space in different iterations and different manifestations. And so I already had all that, right, going into reading Fray Angelico's work. So it wasn't just like, I already had this preconceived stuff and ideas. And because, like I said, I was taking coursework and I was really enmeshed in all of this theory. And I love theory, but I also get very confused very easily. And it all starts to blend together. And it is a theme to be a theory head, right? Because you get so into it that and it starts to like, it makes sense, but then it doesn't. Like, so, and being in American studies and, doing, the pro-sem and all of the major texts that were important at the time and, that kind of thing. So there were all these conversations and discussions about third space theories and also diaspora and like, what do we make? How do we talk about these communities that are in diaspora? And again, this also goes back to my own situation, I guess you could say, because I was really interested also, well, what are the discourses about in place? I was really interested in place, and I didn't want to be dismissive of these conversations that are happening. It was my way also of figuring it out, like, well, also, how do I navigate and balance that regionalism again, which could be so conservative and, like nobody wants to be a regionalist.
For you out there, it has a connotation of being romantic, right?
Yeah, and kind of, an escapist, right? And so I think that was really also, was going in with these theories about the third space and trying to figure out, I guess, not trying to figure out anything really, coming across this idea of the triptych, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. What is that? And then beyond Angelico, figuring out like, well, it goes all the way back to the medieval times and then the Renaissance. It was like a major form of representation for the Virgin Mary. And then you can just go. I went deep into it, like so far deep that I was just like, okay, I got to pull myself back because I'm not doing Renaissance art. But as you can see with something like The Virgin of Port Ligat, which is one of his last book collections of poetry, the Renaissance art was significant. And so you also have to figure out when to stop. If you could just keep going and keep going, and then you'll never get done. Like the point of the dissertation is to finish and then go on to the next stage. But so there's also that balance, like when do you stop?
I wanted to follow up with like, what do you see as, I guess, the limits of the religious lens to critical regionalism in the area? Because the parts where you're getting to like nuclear stuff, I was like, there's a lot more going on, but it's through this like Catholic connection, of course. I just wanted to hear more about what you thought about that.
So tell me the question again.
What are the limits to that like Catholic lens for critical regionalism in this area?
Well, I think the Catholicism can get, especially if you're talking about it locally, I mean, it's a sacred tradition and practice, so I think I'm walking a tightrope, right? Because I'm taking what is essentially the sacred tradition and using it as a critical theory. And so I think that, in terms of the local, I think there are all kinds of limitations, to what I'm doing, or at least to the concept that I'm taking, because as we've seen, these sacred traditions have been very easily appropriated, right? I mean, just look at Trinity, like the name alone, the Trinity test site. So what I would say is, well, we didn't create that. We kind of inherited it, but we also have to be very cognizant of how our work might be exploitative in certain situations. But I balanced it again, I think, by going back to the text, going back to Fray Angelico, and really using him as my evidence so that it's not just like, it's not me, And again, I will say that we always run that risk, especially when we're talking about our communities or local communities and these traditions, But I will say also that for me, it's the text, and I am a textual scholar. Like at the end of the day, that's where my work lies. And I use that in all kinds of ways, playing on that pun. Like it rests in the text, and it also can cause damage. I think that the history of sociology, ethnography, all of these traditions, all these disciplines that we are engaging in have this baggage. So I do think we always need to be cognizant of that. I don't really know if I have the answer in terms of like, there are all kinds of limitations, I think. But I guess what the answer would be, like, I go back to the text and kind of let that guide me in terms of how I deal with that.
Because he goes to Ohio, or because the Franciscans are located there, it's this sort of thing that's being placed on top, this religious lens. So it reminded me of that. That makes it more clear.
Also, you do bring up a great point. And this is one of the reasons why I find Fray Angelico fascinating, because many of the artists and writers of the writers era, 1916 to 1941, they're coming from the Midwest. So they're making this trek, westward from the east, and he reverses it, right? He goes back and becomes educated as a Franciscan. And that's also an interesting history because post-US-Mexico War, the archdiocese, that gets shifted territorially. I mean, before it was Durango. So it was this north-south movement after US-Mexico War. So even the Catholic Church, I think, follows these territorial movements that are very colonial. I mean, they're not immune from that history. So thank you. Actually, I think you redirected me. And that was also for Fray Angelico, like, oh, this guy he went over there. Everyone's coming over here and he went over there. And also, he was friends with all those folks too. And they published his first book of poetry. So yeah, and that's also part of the critical regionalism. If we follow his archive alone, because he does have a library, the Fray Angelico Chavez History Library in Santa Fe, right? There's a lot of collections there. They have some of his work there. But then if you just follow the archive, it takes you to Ohio, takes you to Arkansas. And that alone, that's already like a triangulation of it. And an interesting triangulation that I think expresses what I would say is critical regionalism.
So before we move to another student question, I thought you could expand on something. You talked about deciding when to stop research. But even going back to the earlier process of planning it out, in my experience, and you've got your own graduate students, is that most are planning projects which are huge. And you are thinking about regionalism, you're thinking about the Southwest, you're thinking about all these things, but through Angelico Chavez. We see all these other writers in here that you're describing in the dissertation, because I've got a whole list. And this is, by the way, the chapters are fairly elegant, right? In that you always have this in your triptych, there's always an Angelico Chavez section in the middle paired against these other writers, at least in 4 of the chapters. So you're that is elegant. That's acting this out, and it's nice when there's a certain level of elegance in a dissertation. Most of them aren't elegant. Most books aren't elegant, but those other writers, you don't need to know everything about them. You're not going to look at their archives. You don't need to find out about all the things about their childhood, but you do know that about Angelico Chavez. And then as the scale becomes smaller, all the details emerge. So most of the folks here, not here, but here, are planning projects which are huge. Do you have advice to people about how to create a dissertation project that they can put their arms around?
So for me, again, I mean, I think I was sort of razor focused from the start with Fray Angelico. I think you have to go with where your initial excitement was, like what about your coursework excited you and moved you to research and read and do all this extra work that you were not required to do. If it didn't move you, it just like inspired you, like moved you in your head, if not moved you to the library, like something that just really spoke to you. Because that's what, reading La Conquistadora did for me. And then I ended up reading all his work and doing all this research and, maybe being too focused. But all the writers that I talk about in the dissertation beyond Fray Angelico were people that folks were talking about on the scholarship, right? Either in Southwest studies or in Chicano and Chicana studies. And I do have to say that the Recovery Project, the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Project out of the University of Houston, I mean, that was really foundational for me too, because many of the writers that I'm talking about, Mexican-American writers that I'm talking about were recovery writers. So that whole project, that whole push to go back to literature before 1965 and figure out like the antecedents of the Chicano movement, Chicano literature, that was very, very formative and foundational to me. So I think Fray Angelico that also shaped my focus on Fray Angelico. So I just think that that was like the large picture of what made me excited and interesting was like the Recovery Project and that kind of discussion about what comes before. but specifically was like Fray Angelico's work just really fascinated me. If you've never read La Conquistadora, you should. I mean, it's only like 75 pages. And since, I've taught it and more people know about it, I mean, students say, well, I read this in catechism class. I'm like, oh my gosh, have you read my article on Aztlan? Oh my gosh, that's like, I'm talking about Judith Butler and, gender performance and, I even say I think describe it as like a form of transvestite ventriloquy. And when I was writing that article, she actually came, and La Conquistadora is a statue up at the St. Francis Cathedral. She actually exists, right? And she's a statue for the Reconquest. They dedicated it to her, and she's come under a lot of fire, just for her whole mode of representation. La Conquistadora, the name alone names it. But when I was writing that article for Atlan, because I guess you could say I'm a Lap Catholic. I guess that would be the best way to put it. Personally, I would say I'm a folk Catholic. So I'm Catholic in my heart, So I think this was a moment where I was kind of moving away from the Catholic Church. And that's another whole other underfold story that's kind of informing the interest in La Conquistadora. She came and visited me on multiple occasions in my dream. She haunted me. It's like how forceful it was in my head. Oh, that answers the question, but I think it does just express how passionate I was about Angelico and this work, because again, I think it was also a self-reflection, trying to figure out stuff about my own self and being scholarly about it. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, I think that you wrote about Angelico Chavez and became so focused on Angelico Chavez because he interested you and he addressed the kinds of questions that you wanted to ask. But what you did do, and this is an example for everyone, is you focused on this writer, you knew everything about this writer, and the other ones are secondary. You didn't do archival research into every regionalist writer, Anglo or Chicano or Hispanic or whatever, or Spanish, whatever one. You picked Angelico Chavez is the object of your analysis.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, maybe I call it in the dissertation, I can't remember, but it's critical biography, not straightforward biography, because it's not just about Fray Angelico, but a critical biography, because, I'm situating him within the context of these other writers, who some of them I do know a lot about, like Paredes, you just cannot not know if you're coming out of Chicano studies, not know about him. So, yeah. In terms of the chapters, at least 4 of the chapters lay out this triptych 1, 2, 3. The last chapter, I'll be quite honest, was actually supposed to follow a similar structure. The chapter on history, I think, was supposed to be about the novel, and then it was supposed to be about his 3 historical biographies. But I ran out of time, and it was just I just need to finish it. It's already a big old. It was going to be 400 pages at that point. So the other thing is, the point of the dissertation also is to finish. It's to test your idea, develop it, but really you got to finish. And it could go on forever, right? So it is important to know when to stop. But that's individual for you, So it did take me a while to finish. And I also was raising 2 kids and had a baby Danny and all personal drama, life, domestic stuff. So it took me a while. I think it took me 7 years to finish my whole doctoral program, like my coursework, my comps, my prospectus, dissertation, all those things. So it took me a little while. And I would say I had the support of my department. That's always important. And Chicano studies at the time, when I ran out of funding in American studies, I then went and taught for Chicano studies. So there are ways, and that's also why it's important to have the institutional support of the faculty members going to work with you. And I had really good committee members. I think that they kept me on track. And at some point, Gabrielle is like, yeah, you got to finish this thing. And you still got 2 more chapters to write. Well, maybe you should just write it in one. Yeah, that's a good idea. So if the last chapter looks a little not the same, it's because it was I just got to finish.
Is there another student comment, a question or comment?
I think I'll just do a quick one. I was reading through page 22 to page 30. Something that I thought was pretty interesting as somebody who was born in New Mexico is the discourse of using the term Chicano. Of course, a lot of people know that when you use that term, you might be starting fights in New Mexico because a lot of people don't use that term, or they're like, no, we're Hispanic, we're New Mexican. They don't like using the word Chicano. So, like, when you started looking into how you really wanted to describe him as a writer instead of a Franciscan, at what point did you say, like, I'm really going to start stating that he's a Chicano writer, or like bring up the term in that sense? Because I think that's when you focus on New Mexico or anybody in New Mexico, that's something that you really have to fight with, if how you want to explain that term to people. So I'm curious how you develop that section.
And I think even Fray Angelico would balk at being called a Chicano. Like, you'd be like, no, that's not, I'm Hispanic, right? Or Spanish even, right? So, and I would say, I would have to admit, Rebecca, that's why I was so drawn to Fray Angelico. And I will also say that, Hernando Padilla had already called him a Chicano. People were already calling him Chicano. So in some ways, they already solved the problem for me because they're already calling him Chicano. But I was like, well, whoa, wait a minute, though. I don't think he would call himself Chicano. What is this? So critical regionalism was kind of my out. But I guess I would distinguish between how the writer would identify him, her, or themselves, and how the scholarship or the field, like there's two different things, right? Like there's Chicana studies as a field, and then the person, like the identifier. And those two things aren't the same. And I think that's kind of our job, is to figure out that nuance, or to separate that and to explore that in between our field and how it describes the person and then the person. And those two things aren't always in sync. They are for us, maybe. I know for me, I didn't become Chicana until I got to college. Before that, it was Spanish. Even though I'm largely Pocha, I don't speak Spanish. I understand it. So that really, I will say, if anything, it was that question. It was that curiosity. Everyone's calling him a Chicano, but I don't think he would call himself Chicano. So I would say the distinction there and is really like Chicano and Chicana study, the recovery project, and how they're trying to create this long literary history, which I appreciate. There's power in that, but there's also nuance. And it's always hard, like, to kind of put that on the page. But I would say like that's the distinction, the field, and then the identify, the person. Yeah, but you hit it on the head. I mean, that was really what I was looking for. Like, how do we describe this person? And would be a better, I don't know, more accurate, not better, but more accurate or more nuanced description.
He's clearly with an argument with Chicanos, right? I mean, he knows that there's all these Chicanos out there in New Mexico who he thinks are like the descendants of the Penates and the indigenous people and the folk Catholics, and he's got all these issues with them, and he's inventing this Castizo thing, and he knows that in Spanish people call themselves Mexicano, and so he's in an argument, right?
Yeah.
When he's hanging out at the plaza in Santa Fe, even in the 70s, when he's after being a priest, he's talking in Spanish to people because Spanish was still so much alive, and he knows they're not calling themselves Castizos. He knows they're calling themselves Mexicanos, but he's not comfortable with it. He's engaged in an argument.
And
The ways
yeah,
he enters into our discussion in our field, right? Of Chicano.
that reminds me, though, brings me back to Colton's question. How did you know about the triptych, or at what point did the triptych become relevant? And in what you wrote, I think in 1974, so he was already retired, the height of the Chicano movement, he uses this term called Castizo consciousnness.
Yeah.
And, I had already read Danzaldúa and had already all these theories about mestiza consciousness and third space. I'm like, what? What is that? And then it took me into the castas. It's like, okay, well, what is a castizo? A castizo is a Mexican and a Spaniard. And so it completely eliminates indigeneity altogether, right? So also back to why was the triptych? So what was there? It was already there because I had already read My Penitente Land, but I had all these ideas about consciousness. Oh, because that was the name of the game, like mestiza consciousness, Castizo consciousness. Oh my God, so many consciousnesses.
So another student question. Did I cut you off, Joseph?
No. You kind of went in the same direction I was going based on Rebecca's question, but I also pointing out that within there too, you admit that, Paredes himself does not consider Chavez a Chicano writer by any means. And I mean, his basis for it is interesting, but it's still, I think there's that history of New Mexico as a whole kind of being skipped over between Texas and California in terms of any kind of Chicana discussion, in a sense, because of the peculiarities in New Mexico of history and culture. And so any thoughts on that and how mention it, and then that's always there, to Rebecca's point too. It's not just internally, it's kind of externally placed upon the region as well.
And I would say that's why I'm so fascinated about the culture industry. That's why I'm so fascinated about the writers' era, because I think and the time that it happened, right after statehood, we see it as a cultural movement, but it's really political movement, and like I was really informed by the Spanish Redemption, Charles Montgomery's work, and like talking about this whole idea of the Spanish revival. So I think it also made me aware that, this terminology of Spanish, not that it goes all the way back to the Spanish colonial. No, it goes back to early 20th century when it was revived as something that was better than being Mexican. And that, I think, is really formative, if not foundational, to the way people perceive New Mexico, but also to the way we perceive ourselves. This is not just external, it's also internal. And so I think that's why that era is so fascinating to me and why I'm so stuck on it in a way that is like, well, I think we need to understand this. We can't just skip over it like, that was just white people being who they are. No, I think it's very foundational to the place. And so now I've developed my thinking about critical regionalism in that sense, really thinking about like, well, what makes New Mexico unique? And in many ways, that's it. I mean, just think about the difference between New Mexico and Arizona. I mean, we gained statehood at the same exact time, but the industries are so different. And also the demographics. We have a huge indigenous population here. I don't think it's as easy, I'll put that in quotes, to claim indigeneity in a place where we have so many tribal nations. You just drive up to Taos and you've driven through how many different nations. So we don't really see that, but we feel it because it's domestic or internal or whatever. So I always go back to this early period in the 20th century, and I'm still thinking about it and theorizing about it, I guess you could say. And, there's been a lot of conversations about settler colonialism, which I would say has the same sort of movement and is in conversations much like critical regionalism when I, 10 years, 15 years ago or whatnot. There's a lot of potential there to think about the Southwest. So I don't think folks are really doing it in that capacity because it's so fraught with so many different people. Even the native nations are different. They're not the same, right? So yeah, I'm thinking through that now, and I have a book under review. It's a book on Chicana deserts. It's called Chicana Desertscapes, but the introduction is really talking about this idea of this culture industry. And so my idea of critical regionalism is developed into an idea of settler regionalism. So that's kind of the term that I'm trying to put on the map, if so to speak. but that's the term I use to talk about this early era of culture and the arts and literature, and it doesn't go away. And I think that's what makes New Mexico unique, you know.
So can I ask to follow up with, you said your second book is about this idea of settler regionalism. Can you consider Chavez in his late work, especially settler regionalism?
I think there's definitely more synergy in that respect, but I think the difference is that the culture industry is something that he subscribed to. He didn't create it, right? So I would say yes, he was definitely aligned with these, writers who were producing this kind of colonial, or if you will, post-colonial, post-statehood concept of the region. I would say definitely he's much more aligned with them, but I think there's a difference in terms of the power dynamic and the power structure, So that's why I would say, if anything, I would call him a micro-regionalist, which I think is even more reactionary, but still within that structure, right, of what is settler regionalism. Thank you.
Well, I want to have more of a conversation about this. It's really interesting. In My Penitente Land, right, he's drawing this lineage to Spain and then to the Holy Land, and he's using the Exodus narrative. And in the Exodus narrative, as we know, and like Robert Warrior says, like there's also the Canaanites, and he's saying Native people should identify with the Canaanites in My Penitente Land, and Angelico Chavez is using the Exodus narrative. He's identifying with the Hebrews, with the Israelites, and then the native people themselves are the Canaanites in that story, right? What happened at Acoma is a retelling of something biblical in which the Spanish colonial settlers, who included a bunch of native people, but they're the Israelites, and the people of Acoma are the Canaanites.
It's highly problematic, but also just, this the whole Zionist, I guess, bent aspect behind My Penitente Land, I think, which again, I mean, I guess one could read that as critical regionalism, but then again, one could also go back to these conversations about settler colonialism and the conversations that are happening now around that. And I think certainly one could make that argument about Fray Angelico. It's definitely there, especially in that book, My Penitente Land. And he's having an argument with the Chicano movement, and he's also having an argument with Vatican II. Like he left the priesthood, he left the church as in protest of Vatican II. He's having these big arguments with these larger structures, using New Mexico as kind of like the test site for that. But absolutely, I mean, yeah, you get into that discussion, and I think there's a lot more to illustrate in the ways that Fray Angelico is more colonial than Chicano. And I would say, as we get more towards the Chicano movement, he becomes more colonial, like more like, no, we're uniquely Spanish here in this place. So yeah, problematic guy. That's how, I don't know, but he sparked conversation, it's like, because he does represent a kind of I don't know if you could call it a hidden voice. I would say a voice that I think in many ways Chicano studies has been grappling with, like, well, what do we do with it? And in many ways they just like, well, let's just dismiss them. They're just suffering from a hacienda syndrome. So we'll just skip over them. For me, I'm in the cradle, I'm in the belly of the beast. So,
Do you have parting words for people who are at this point in their career?
Parting words, like I said, I think I said this before, trying to avoid the sun. I would say you should enjoy this time in your professional career, because it is the moment where you are allowed just to sit and read and think about your own scholarship and work. I think it was important for me to figure out my audience. A lot of times we're writing and we're just kind of writing to our screen or to ourselves, and it's really hard to figure out, well, who is this for? And I think that's the importance of like figuring out what is your field or what are your fields. If you can identify that, then I think it's much easier for you to figure out what's the intervention you're making. But it's also easier for you to frame your study and know what are the limitations of your own methodology or the material that you're collecting and bringing together in your work. Because, like we said, it could go on forever. But if you can, that's really important that you could try to link your comps to your dissertation and use the comps at the very least to figure out, how do you identify as a scholar? What are the fields that are informing your work and how you want to situate what you're doing? And then from there, like, people are going to identify who you are. You think you're writing one thing and then it looks very neat and good, and you put it out in the world and it becomes something else, and you have to let that happen too, because one of the most terrifying things is sharing your work, because it's so personal and you put so much into it, and then you put it out there and you expose it to criticism, and that's very scary. But I think you should welcome the criticism, because it allows you also to figure out, like, oh, who is my audience and how should I be shaping this? And you don't always have to follow the criticism. I mean, you don't have to agree with it, you don't have to follow it, but acknowledge it, because that's what your audience is looking for. And so you have to address it. That doesn't mean you have to follow it and to a T, because if they're telling you to do something against which you want to go with your work, then don't. But you do need to address it. And that's the beauty of our field, of our work, is you don't have to be right. You have to have evidence. You can't just say whatever, but you also don't have to necessarily comply, so to speak, but you do have to address what people are pointing out and still maintain your authenticity, your original idea. I think that's important. And you will run into some antagonistic readers, and you never know what is informing that. Again, there's always something else driving whatever it is. I think the more open you are to criticism, the better you're going to be able to navigate and shape your work in a way that you want to present it to the world. And just know that after that, it kind of becomes an entity of its own. And you also have to be open to that too. Your ideas have to be elastic enough to bend, stretch, bounce, and still like maintain some kind of shape or form. Because it can't be like so rigid, nobody can say anything about it. It can't be so stretched out that there's no shape at all. But it has to be flexible. You have to be open to the antagonistic comments and just keep going with it, I mean, throw it across, curse, cry, then go back. Get back to it, because you have an idea and you should stick to it and just find ways to prop it up enough where, like I said, it has this kind of durability beyond your head, which is such a precious thing. So thank you. I mean, I appreciate you so much reading my work. It means so much to me, because like I said, we put it out there and then, say goodbye. See it again. And I please, I'm right. Well, we're all spread out now because the Humanities building is no more, but I am on campus. And, my email, right? Please email me if you need any assistance. You want to sit down and have a coffee. You want to talk about your project. I would love to do that. I'm open to it. I want to thank Michael for inviting me. And yeah, thank you so much for entertaining me.
Thank you for writing this dissertation and for talking to us. It's a beautiful dissertation, and I found this discussion really fruitful.